Welcome to Boring History for Sleep. Tonight we travel back through time, not to the glory of battle or the wealth of kings, but to the cold stone walls of medieval castles. As you close your eyes and drift into the past, let's explore why these towering fortresses were not quite the cozy homes they seemed. Picture a castle, high on a hill, gray, imposing, with banners flapping in the wind. It looks strong, secure, majestic. But inside, it was cold. Very cold. The stone walls were thick, yes, but stone is not warm. In winter, the cold seeped in and stayed. Fireplaces helped, but only slightly. Most castles had only a few chimneys, and smoke often lingered in the rooms. The windows were small, narrow slits called arrow loops. They were built for defense, not light or warmth. Glass was rare and expensive. Most windows were just open holes, sometimes covered with cloth, animal skin, or wooden shutters. There was no insulation, no central heating, no carpets, at least not on the stone floors. People laid down straw or rushes, mixed with herbs like lavender to mask odors, but that did little to stop the cold. Even in the Great Hall, the heart of the castle, the fire might crackle in the hearth, but the heat rarely reached your toes. So how did people keep warm? Layers, lots of layers. Woolen tunics, undergarments of linen, heavy cloaks, fur linings, hats and gloves indoors. People huddled together. Nobles and servants alike would gather near the hearth, share body heat, and drink warm ale or broth. Beds were built with heavy curtains, pulled shut at night to trap warmth. Hot stones or iron pots filled with coals were placed under bedding. Still, it was never enough. Cold was a constant companion. Life in a castle was not glamorous. Drafts crept in through the cracks in the stone. Moisture collected on the walls. Mold grew in damp corners. Bathing was rare. Laundry froze on the line. People rose with the sun and went to bed early, not out of discipline, but to escape the chill. In the kitchens, the fires burned hottest. Servants would linger there not just for food, but for warmth. But even the cooks suffered. The heat was intense in summer, yet vanished in winter. Water froze in barrels. Bread hardened fast. Butter had to be chopped with knives. What about the royal family? Kings and queens had it better, but not by much. Their chambers were larger, which meant harder to heat. Tapestries were hung on walls to block wind. Thick carpets and furs covered their beds, but even they wore layers to sleep, and even they complained of the cold. One medieval queen was said to have slept with 3 dogs under her blankets. Not for company, but for warmth. Some rulers even relocated in winter, moving south to warmer castles if possible, but many simply endured. Bathrooms were no escape. Bathrooms were no escape. The garderobe medieval toilet was a stone bench over a shaft that led outside the walls. Cold air rushed up the opening. In winter, using it was unpleasant. Servants sometimes brought heated stones to make it tolerable. There was no running water. No heated baths. People wiped their hands with cloth or straw, and hand washing was not common. The cold discouraged it. Yet, people adapted. Children played indoors with carved wooden toys. Women embroidered by candlelight with gloves on. Men drank mulled wine. Guests at feasts wore heavy robes and toasted near the fire. Candles and rushlights flickered. Dogs curled near their masters. Nights were long, quiet, cold, but people laughed, loved, lived. Over time, castles changed. Glass windows were added. Chimneys became more common. Tapestries grew thicker, carpets softer. Architecture shifted toward comfort. But still, the legacy of cold lingers. Even today, some preserved castles feel icy in summer. Stone remembers. So, next time you picture a princess in her tower, imagine her wrapped in fur, breathing mist in her room, a knight at his watch, shivering beneath chainmail, a king at his throne, with chilled feet and a hot drink in hand. Now, let it fade. The torchlight dims, the cold becomes memory, the wind softens, and you, warm in your bed, drift into sleep. Good night. Let the past keep its chill while you rest in peace. Once you passed through the heavy wooden gates and entered the echoing stone corridors of a medieval castle, you were met with a chill that never seemed to leave. The thick stone walls, built for defense, also trapped in the cold. Even in the height of summer, the castle interior remained damp and cool. In winter, it was worse. Biting drafts slipped through every crack, and fires in the hearths were rarely enough to warm the large open halls. Most castles didn't have chimneys. Instead, smoke from fires drifted upward through holes in the ceiling. This left many rooms smoky, dark, and hard to breathe in. Tapestries were hung, not just for decoration, but to add a little insulation. They tried to keep out the chill, but in truth, they barely helped. The floors were often bare stone, or, if you were lucky, covered in rushes. These rushes, dried plants like hay, were meant to absorb dirt, and were rarely changed. They trapped not only dust, but insects, food scraps, and worse. Beds were made of wood, with thin straw mattresses that offered little comfort. Heavy wool blankets were piled high, but your breath still misted in the air on winter nights. Even royals felt the cold. Kings and queens would sleep in layered night clothes, with dogs curled at their feet, to help keep warm. And yet, despite the discomfort, people adapted. They wore layers of wool and fur. They gathered close to fires, and lived much of their lives in the same few rooms, the warmest ones. Servants and soldiers were often worse off. They slept in dormitories with little to no heat, or even in the stables alongside animals. Children huddled together in shared beds. And people rose early, not because they were rested, but because lying still meant getting colder. Imagine waking up in the early hours of a winter morning in the 14th century. The sun has not yet risen. The only light in your chamber is the faint orange glow of a dying hearth, if you were lucky enough to have one. The cold creeps in through the walls, through the floors, and even from the very stone that surrounds you. Stone. Cold, hard, unforgiving stone. It made castles strong, almost impenetrable, but it also made them cruel to live in. The walls of these mighty buildings were often several feet thick. Designed to withstand sieges and cannon fire, they were never intended to hold warmth. No matter how many tapestries or wooden panels you hung, the bitter cold would always find a way through. Fireplaces were a luxury, and even then, poorly efficient. Smoke often filled the rooms instead of escaping through the chimneys, leaving black stains on ceilings and soot in the lungs. And yet castles were homes, not just for kings and nobles, but for hundreds of servants, guards, cooks, and clerics, each trying to find a bit of warmth in these drafty stone monsters. The kitchens, deep below the main halls, were often the warmest part of the castle. But even here, the air was damp and heavy with ash and grease. Castles were rarely designed with comfort in mind. They were fortresses first, homes second. Let's walk into one of those kitchens. A huge iron pot bubbles slowly over a hearth. The cook, wrapped in layers of wool, stirs with numb fingers. Around her, assistants carry baskets of turnips, stale bread, and salted meat. The air is warm, but the stone floor below is wet and slick, and the ceiling drips with condensation. The walls are blackened from decades of smoke, and yet people are grateful to be here, for it's the only warmth they'll feel today. Above in the grand hall, lords dine with guests, their breath visible in the air as they speak. Torches flicker, throwing shadows across high ceilings. Tapestries depicting battles and saints try in vain to cover the icy stone. The cold was not only physical, it was part of life. It shaped habits, daily routines, and even fashion. Woolen undergarments, fur-lined cloaks, and mittens were necessary not just outdoors, but indoors too. As the cold crept through the halls of stone, life inside the castle was not only uncomfortable, it was often unsanitary. Without modern plumbing, most castles relied on chamber pots and primitive latrines called garderobes, which were built into the thick walls. Waste would drop down chutes to the outside or into a cesspit below. On cold nights, these drafty garderobes were chilling to visit. And in winter, when pipes would have frozen if they'd existed, people simply kept the pot beside their bed. The smell was often unavoidable. Even though herbs like lavender or rosemary were sometimes scattered on rushes to mask it, odors lingered in the stonework, the wooden beams, and the heavy drapes. Some areas of the castle were rarely cleaned at all. Servants might sweep rushes out occasionally, but full-scale cleaning was rare and difficult. This poor hygiene brought with it another discomfort: pests. Castles were full of rats, mice, and fleas. Rats would scurry behind walls and under floorboards. They gnawed at stored grain, crept across sleeping bodies, and carried diseases. Fleas and lice were common, and everyone, from peasants to kings, dealt with itchy scalps and irritated skin. Cats were kept not for affection, but for pest control, and even they couldn't keep up. Fireplaces were few, often one per room, if that, and rarely built in servant quarters. Even in grand halls, people huddled close to the fire for warmth, but the heat never reached far. Those tasked with keeping fires going, known as night watchmen or stokers, walked through the frigid corridors with torches or tallow candles, adding logs and poking at embers. Their job was quiet, lonesome, and cold. They wrapped themselves in cloaks and kept moving to avoid freezing in place. Windows, if there were any, didn't help. In wealthier castles, they were covered with thin pieces of horn or oiled cloth. Glass was expensive and rare. In winter, these coverings kept out some wind, but not the cold. Drafts swirled down hallways, curled under doors, and slipped through the cracks in walls and ceilings. For those who lived in the towers higher above, the wind was worse. Towers were exposed to all weather, and the top rooms could be unbearably cold. Guards stationed there braved icy gales in exchange for a better view of the surrounding lands. They'd pace back and forth, stamping their feet to stay warm. But sometimes, even that wasn't enough.
有州向盛名，助整年的战役之艰難，就整連多強戰難棍多中央老就免戰央打爛的。
Meanwhile, life for castle children was no fairy tale. Young ones were bundled in wool, their cheeks red with cold. Lessons were taught in chilly corners, and play often meant indoor games involving sticks, stones, and imagination. The lucky ones might sit by the fire in the Great Hall, but only briefly, before being shooed off by someone more important. Castles may seem majestic from a distance, but inside, life could be quite grim. One of the most uncomfortable truths about castle life was how unrelentingly cold and damp everything remained. The thick stone walls were excellent at keeping out arrows and invaders, but unfortunately, they were just as skilled at keeping out warmth. There was no insulation, and the concept of cozy central heating was centuries away. Fireplaces were often grand and imposing, but they did little to heat an entire room, especially one with high ceilings and drafty windows. Most of the floors were made of stone or old wooden planks, and walking across them barefoot was like stepping on frozen earth. Woolen socks and leather shoes were helpful, but not always enough to prevent numb toes. Servants would lay rushes, dried plants, on the floor, sometimes mixed with herbs to help soak up moisture and cover the cold stone. But even that provided minimal comfort. People wore layers upon layers of clothing indoors. Wealthier residents might wear fur-lined cloaks, while common folk bundled in scratchy wool and linen, often never fully warming up. Washing up was also a challenge. Water had to be carried in and heated by fire, making warm baths a rare luxury. More often than not, people simply went unwashed for long periods, and bathing was considered a health risk during some periods. Even the beds, those great carved wooden frames with heavy curtains, weren't always warm. While the curtains helped trap body heat, mattresses were stuffed with straw or feathers and could grow musty over time. People often slept with hats on their heads and multiple blankets pulled tightly around them, and some even shared beds not for affection but for warmth. Beyond the physical discomforts, life in a castle could be lonely and dull, especially in the winter months. Days were shorter, work slowed, and rooms were dim, lit only by candlelight or flickering torches. There were no radios, no books for the uneducated, and certainly no screens. Entertainment was limited to the occasional bard or tale-teller, or perhaps games like chess or dice, played by candlelight. Communication was slow. Letters had to be carried on horseback across muddy roads. News from beyond the castle walls might not arrive for weeks, and in the meantime, people relied on gossip, church sermons, or the rare visit from a traveler. Servants worked tirelessly to maintain the castle, but their lives were equally bleak. They awoke early, often in frigid conditions, to fetch water, prepare fires, and carry out endless chores. And unlike the lords and ladies, they did so without even the smallest comfort of a private chamber. In the kitchens, the cold mixed with smoke and heat, as great fires were used to prepare meals. But even these places of warmth were only temporary refuge. Most of the food prepared was bland and repetitive. In winter, meals were often salted meat and stale bread, with little in the way of fresh produce.